Night settles gently over the Aegean, the way a soft cloak is laid over shoulders at the end of a long day, and somewhere between familiar shores and unknown islands a dark ship moves slowly through the water, its sail barely filled, its oars drawn in and resting like tired limbs. The sea is calm tonight, carrying the vessel without hurry, and above it the sky is deep and clear, filled with stars that have watched over human journeys since the first fires were lit on rocky coasts. Odysseus stands near the prow, one hand resting lightly on the railing, and the lines of his face, worn by salt and wind and years of wandering, are softened by the starlight so that he almost looks like the young man he once was, long before war and clever schemes and promises to kings turned his life into an endless series of departures. Around him his men sleep in small clusters, wrapped in cloaks that still smell faintly of smoke and wool and sea, and the quiet creak of timbers, the slow breathing of exhausted bodies, and the soft, rhythmic whisper of the water are the only sounds that keep him company as the ship glides over the wine-dark sea. He has known nights full of shouting winds and jagged waves, when the sea rose up like a god in a bad mood and every breath tasted of fear and brine, but this is not one of those nights, and he is grateful, in his own restrained and somewhat stubborn way, for the simple gift of calm. The sail hangs loose, like a tired lung after a long sigh, and the mast cuts a dark line against the sky, pointing toward constellations that sailors have followed for generations, long before anyone thought to sing of heroes or carve their names into stone. He knows those constellations well, not as decorations in the sky but as patient, dependable guides, the slow turning of the Great Bear, the steady path of Orion, the faint dust of the Milky Way that looks like the trail of some forgotten procession of gods. He watches them with the kind of familiarity one reserves for old acquaintances who never ask too many questions, and for a moment, as the ship rises and falls on the gentle swell, he allows himself to feel not like a hunted man, but simply a sailor who has been on the sea a little too long. On nights like this, when the sea is quiet and the gods seem, if not kind, then at least distracted by other matters, his thoughts drift back to Ithaca with a softness that almost surprises him. He sees the island not as a line on a map but as a series of small, steady images, the terraces of gray-green olive trees stepping down a hillside, the dry stone walls built by hands that knew every flaw in the rock, the goats picking their way along narrow paths with the certainty that only goats possess, and the low, smoky light of the hearth in his own hall, where once, many years and an entire war ago, he lay down to sleep believing that his journeys would be of the ordinary sort. There is a quiet in that memory that he has not felt in years, a quiet made of familiar sounds, the low murmur of servants finishing the last tasks of the day, the faint click of a loom as Penelope worked by lamplight long after others had grown tired, the small sighs of a child asleep in an inner room, who would one day carry a spear but for now clutched only a blanket. He remembers the way the air in that hall smelled at night, a mixture of wood smoke and olive oil, wool and bread and the faint, comforting sourness of wine that had been opened and set aside, and he remembers how the stone beneath his feet kept a trace of the day's warmth even as the night air cooled the upper world. It is not a palace by the standards of great kings, he thinks, not like the vast courts of Troy or the high-walled halls of Mycenae with their painted lions and gleaming bronze, but it is his, and in the end that simple fact matters more than all the polished marble in the world. He imagines Penelope beside the hearth, the lamp's small flame drawing a circle of gold around her hands as they move with patient skill, thread passing through thread as if weaving were a measured form of prayer. He imagines her pausing, just once, to listen to the night beyond the door, wondering whether he is still out there on some restless sea. And then returning to her work because there is nothing else she can do but wait. On the deck, far from that remembered hall, a sailor turns in his sleep and mutters something unintelligible, one hand clutching his cloak more tightly as if even in dreams he expects the wind to steal it away. The ship tilts slightly, gently, as a long, low swell passes beneath it, and Odysseus feels the motion in his bones in the way that everyone who has lived too long on water eventually does, the body learning to sway in time with waves even when the mind is elsewhere. He walks slowly along the deck, careful not to disturb the men, stepping over tangled rope and around a bundle of spare oars, and pauses near the mast where an old amphora of water rests, cool from the night air, its clay surface damp with condensation. He takes a sip, tasting the faint mineral tang of some distant spring, and sets it down again, thinking how odd it is that a man who has eaten at the tables of kings and shared feasts with gods can find such quiet satisfaction in a simple drink of water on a calm night. The air has that particular coolness that belongs to hours long after sunset and long before dawn, when the day's heat has finally bled away from stone and sail and skin, and the world feels, for a short while, clean and bare and almost new. From somewhere beyond the low black outline of the horizon comes the faint cry of a night bird, thin and distant but clear in the stillness, and the ship moves toward it without any real intention, the way a sleeper sometimes rolls toward the sound of a familiar voice. For all his famed cleverness, Odysseus knows that there are many things he cannot control, and he has come, not willingly but stubbornly, to accept that there are nights when the best one can do is to stand on the deck of a small ship under a vast sky and be present for the turning of the world. Later, when the night has settled deeper and the stars seem closer, as if they have bent down to listen more carefully to the murmurs of mortals, he lies down among his men, using a folded cloak and a coil of rope as a pillow. The wood beneath him is hard, and there is a persistent smell of pitch and salt that no amount of cleaning will ever fully remove, but his body, tired from years of strain, accepts this with little complaint. He pulls his cloak around his shoulders, feeling the rough wool scratch lightly against his neck, and listens to the layered sounds of the ship at rest, the intermittent creak of timber, the soft thud of rope shifting with each slight movement of the hull, the whisper of waves that are more lullaby than threat tonight. Somewhere in that gentle confusion of sound he can hear his own heartbeat, slow and steady, a reminder that he is still here, still moving through this long and unlikely journey between war and home. Sleep comes to him not as an abrupt fall but as a gradual softening, a blurring of edges as the line between waking thought and dream yields like fabric under a careful hand. Images of Ithaca and its terraces, its olive trees and worn stone thresholds, weave themselves together with the sight of these foreign stars and the curving edge of the sea, until he is no longer quite sure whether he is standing on the deck of his ship or walking along the ridge above his own harbor, listening to the goats clatter on the stones below. In that in-between place where Hypnos is said to wait, the world feels strangely gentle, and even the gods, who have so often seemed amused by his struggles, recede to a respectful distance, watching but not interfering, at least for a few precious hours. By the time the eastern horizon begins to pale, just enough to draw the first thin distinction between sea and sky, the men are stirring, rubbing sleep from their eyes and sitting up slowly, joints protesting in a language older than any epic. The night's quiet is not entirely gone, but it is loosening its hold, making room for the modest sounds of waking, a cough, a muttered complaint about stiff limbs, the rustle of cloaks shaken free of dew. Odysseus rises with them, stretching carefully, and watches as one of the younger sailors leans over the side of the ship to splash cold seawater on his face, gasping softly at the shock. It is, in its own way, a kind of dawn ritual, less formal than temple rites but perhaps more honest, and he finds a dry, almost hidden amusement in how even rough men who have faced monsters and storms still seek, at the start of each day, a way to feel a little more clean and awake. Before long, another night settles, as they often do in those wandering years when days blur into one another and islands appear and vanish like thoughts. This time, the ship has found a small sheltered inlet on an unnamed shore, a curve of sand that cradles it gently while the waves outside break themselves against unseen rocks like tired warriors returning to old arguments. The crew has drawn the vessel close enough that its keel rests lightly on the ground, half in water and half on sand, like some beached creature catching its breath, and a small fire has been coaxed to life a little way up the beach, where the wind is less eager to steal its sparks. Around that fire, cloaks are spread and provisions unpacked, hard bread, a pot of barley and lentils simmering slowly, a little cheese wrapped carefully in cloth, all of it simple and yet, after another day of uncertainty, deeply welcome. Odysseus sits with his men, close enough to feel the heat of the fire on his face and the cool of the night on his back, and watches the steam rise from the pot in slow, twisting ribbons that catch the firelight and vanish into the dark as if carrying prayers that no one has put into words. The men speak quietly, their voices low and rough-edged, telling each other stories that they have already heard many times but that somehow make the present moment more bearable, small tales of home, of ill-tempered goats and stubborn brothers, of mothers who scold and then embrace, of market days and harvest feasts and the way the light falls on familiar courtyards in late afternoon. He does not interrupt, and they do not ask him for stories tonight, perhaps sensing that the weight he carries is of a slightly different sort, and that even the most eloquent of men sometimes needs the kindness of silence. When the food is ready, bowls and wooden cups are passed around, and the men eat with the straightforward attention of those who understand that there is nothing particularly noble about hunger but that it is better answered than ignored. The barley stew is thick and a little smoky from the fire, and the bread, though hard, softens when dipped into it, soaking up warmth and flavor along with the faint taste of ash from the bowl's rim. A small measure of wine, wisely diluted with water, passes from hand to hand, not in celebration but as a quiet acknowledgement that they have survived yet another day. In the shifting circle of firelight, their faces look older, younger, and somehow more themselves, all at once, and Odysseus, watching them, feels a mixture of responsibility and companionship that is as familiar to him now as the feel of an oar grip in his palm. Later, when the pot has been emptied and the fire has settled into a bed of glowing coals, he rises and walks a little way down the beach to where the sea whispers against the sand, leaving and returning with the persistent patience that only waves possess. He carries with him a small cup, filled not to the brim but modestly, and he stops near a weathered rock that stands out from the shore like a patient witness. There, without any grand ceremony and certainly without an audience, he pours a small portion of the wine onto the ground and into the sea, letting it darken the sand and vanish into the water. His words, when he speaks them, are simple and almost conversational, as if addressing an old neighbor who happens also to rule the depths and stir up earthquakes when irritated. He speaks of safe passage, of fair winds, of forgiveness that he does not entirely expect, and ends with a quiet admission that he is simply a man trying to find his way home. The sea does not answer, as seas rarely do in ways that men can quote, but the wave that comes up to meet the shore seems to linger a little, washing gently over his feet and the stone where the libation fell, as if acknowledging the effort if not granting the request outright. He stands there for a moment, feeling the water seep into the leather of his sandals and the cool sand shifting under his weight, and allows himself a faint, wry smile at the thought that somewhere, perhaps, a god has paused for the length of a breath to listen to one more mortal ask for one more impossible favor. Then he turns back toward the fire, where his men are already settling into their makeshift beds, and finds his own place among them, the shore at his back, the ship nearby like a dark companion resting after a long day. There were other islands, too, in those years, some bright with hospitality, some steeped in enchantment, some nothing more than brief stops on a journey that already seemed endless, but in memory, the loudest edges of those stories soften, as if the mind itself has decided to make them more suitable for retelling under quiet stars. The island of the Wind Keeper, for example, might have been remembered as a place of tempests and arguments and unwise curiosity, yet in the hours when sleep creeps in and demands something more gentle, another version of it rises instead. He recalls a high house of polished stone, where the air always smelled faintly of distant rain and wildflowers, and where curtains stirred even when no breeze could be felt outside. The lord of that place, a man whose moods could shift as quickly as the weather he kept in strange leather bags, had, in calmer moments, offered warm food and soft beds and the rare experience of a night when the sea did not roar in his dreams. On that island, there were evenings when the only sound inside the house was the soft conversation of servants and the occasional discreet laughter from some other room, and the storm that rattled the shutters was not outside but carefully knotted and tied, stored for future use, a reminder that even chaos can sometimes be hung up and silenced if one knows exactly how. Odysseus, who understood more than most the value of container and lid, had slept there with a kind of uneasy comfort, wrapped in thick wool and lying on a bed that did not roll and pitch beneath him. Even then, though, in that uncharacteristically stable night, he had found himself half awake, listening to the faint creak of leather in the next chamber where the winds were stored, thinking how strange it was that every gentle breeze and every terrible gale might be sleeping side by side only a few steps away. There was Circe's island as well, remembered by others mainly for its more dramatic transformations and less for the quieter hours that followed, yet it was in those quieter hours that his men truly began to feel human again. The house of the sorceress, with its polished floors and painted walls, its orderly rows of jars and herbs and its well-fed lions and wolves who behaved like slightly overbearing dogs, provided them with something rarer than magic, rest. After the first fearful days, when the threat of enchantment seemed to lurk behind every cup and word, there came evenings when the only spells at work were the ordinary ones of warm water, clean clothes, and food shared without immediate danger. They slept on proper couches there, their heads cushioned for once by something softer than rope or bundled cloaks, and the air in their sleeping rooms smelled of crushed leaves and smoke and the faint sweetness of whatever flowers grew in Circe's garden. Lamps burned steadily through the night, their small flames guarded from draughts by curved glass or careful placement, and shadows played gently along the walls, turning painted figures into patient spectators of mortal exhaustion. Odysseus, lying on one such couch, had listened to the slow, even breathing of his men in the next room and wondered, not for the first time, whether rest bought at the price of delay was a bargain or a trap. The question had followed him into sleep, where it softened into images, waves that did not break, shores that did not recede, and a distant silhouette of Ithaca always just beyond the next horizon. On another island, farther still from the smoking ruins of Troy and from any realistic map, the nymph Calypso kept a home that might have made immortality itself seem almost reasonable. Her cave, if one insists on calling it that, was a place where the air was always mild and fragrant, where vines heavy with ripe grapes trailed lazily from the rock, and where the sound of the sea arrived softened by distance, more lullaby than warning. The stone floor was smoother than most royal chambers, worn not by armies of servants but by the steady passage of water and time, and pools of clear, fresh water reflected the light of day in a way that made it seem as if small fragments of sky had fallen and decided to rest there. Birds called from the trees outside, not in alarm but in the idle way of creatures who have never had to learn the meaning of hunger. There, too, Odysseus slept, though sleep on that island had a different weight to it, like a cloak lined with very fine lead, warm, almost luxurious, and yet difficult to push off when one needed to rise. The bed that Calypso made for him was built of polished wood and woven with fine linen, a masterpiece of comfort and care, and at night he lay on it listening to the soft rush of the small waterfall at the cave's entrance and the distant murmur of waves beyond. The nymph herself, with her strange mixture of tenderness and insistence, moved through that space like a woman in a dream she did not intend to wake from, offering him the one thing that had become both tempting and impossible, the chance not to go home, not to grow old, not to end. Yet even surrounded by such gentleness, even with his tired body grateful for every moment of rest, his thoughts continued to slip past the silk-soft promises of eternal ease and return, stubbornly, to images of a narrow bed in Ithaca and a woman weaving beside a modest hearth. Nights on that island were long and heavy, with stars that seemed almost too bright, as if reminding him that time still flowed somewhere beyond the enchantment that slowed it here. He would stand sometimes at the threshold of the cave, looking out at the sea that divided him from his own world, and feel a slow, patient ache that had nothing to do with the wounds and bruises he had carried from battlefields and shipwrecks. The gods had, in their peculiar generosity, given him safe harbor, soft blankets, and fruit that never spoiled, but they had also given him longing, and longing, he had begun to understand, could outlast marble, bronze, and even the memory of war. Not every shore he reached was wrapped in such gentle illusions, of course. Some were harsh and some were dangerous in ways that left scars on memory more than on flesh. Yet even in those places, there were nights when the more dramatic elements of the story slipped quietly into the background, yielding to the simple, universal rhythm of exhaustion and rest. He remembers, for instance, an island where the day had been full of shouts and the clash of arms and the kind of choices that leave a sour taste in the mouth, and yet the night that followed brought such stillness that for a few hours it was possible to forget that heroes and monsters had shared the same daylight. The men had camped that evening near a stand of low trees, their branches twisted by wind and time into shapes that looked almost like old warriors in conversation. They built a fire among the roots, careful to shield it from wandering eyes, and ate what little they had salvaged with the quiet focus of those who know there may be less tomorrow. The moon rose late, trailing a faint haze behind it, and the sea beyond the trees shone like hammered silver, beautiful and indifferent. Around the fire, faces that had been contorted by fear and fury earlier now appeared simply tired, the lines at the corners of the eyes deeper, the hands that held cups and knives a little less steady. One man, whose name would never make its way into any poem, fell asleep sitting upright, his head gradually drooping toward his chest until a neighbor, without comment, slid a folded cloak behind his back to keep him from toppling over. Odysseus, who had spent the day calculating risks and possibilities as carefully as any merchant reckons his accounts, found himself, for once, without any useful thoughts left. He lay on his side near the edge of the group. Between a root that dug into his hip and a rock that pressed against his shoulder, and looked up through the branches at a small square of sky framed by leaves. In that square, a handful of stars glittered with the untroubled calm of things that have watched countless battles, shipwrecks, and negotiations and have never once felt compelled to intervene. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to think of nothing at all, to simply lie there and let the sounds of breathing, the mild crackle of the fire, and the rhythmic hiss of distant waves fill the spaces where strategies and regrets usually lived. In that unremarkable, almost anonymous night, he slept more deeply than he had on any enchanted couch or under any gilded ceiling. Eventually, as all stories that wander must do, his path bent toward the island of the Phaeacians, a place that seemed almost like a dream told by one sailor to another across a tavern table, ships that moved as if they could feel and decide, palaces where bronze gleamed like captured sunlight even in the dim light of lamps, and people whose greatest concern at the end of the day was whether a song had been sung well enough to be remembered. There, after so many nights spent on rough boards and rougher ground, he found himself within walls that smelled not of smoke and salt and fear, but of polished wood, fine wool, and the faint perfume of oils pressed from distant flowers. The hall of Alcinous, with its columns and its carefully painted walls, was not a place built for war councils or sacrifice, but for the quieter rituals of hospitality, the laying out of clean garments, the offering of basins for washing, the measured distribution of food and wine that said, more clearly than any speech, that the stranger who crossed the threshold was, for a time, no longer merely a wanderer but a guest. In the corner of that hall, near the great doors where the night air slipped in along the floor, a bed was prepared for him, not a royal couch but a solid, comfortable resting place with smooth sheets and layered blankets that carried the faint scent of stored cedar and herbs. When he lay down there, after the long, unburdening labor of telling his tale to listeners who were not trying to kill him or recruit him or detain him forever, the silence that followed was as rich and deep as any treasure chest. He could hear, from elsewhere in the building, the softened sounds of a household at rest, footsteps moving more slowly, voices reduced to murmurs, a door closing gently somewhere, the faint clang of a vessel set down in a kitchen. Outside, beyond the high walls, the city itself settled, its streets no longer crowded with chariots and traders, its harbor filled with ships that rocked gently in their berths, watched over by the same stars that had seen him drift for years. In his room, a single lamp burned low, its flame small but steady, and the shadows it cast on the ceiling moved slowly, like clouds passing across a distant hillside. He lay there, staring up at them, feeling the softness of the mattress beneath him and the unfamiliar luxury of a blanket that covered him entirely without leaving his feet exposed to drafts, and thought how strange it was that sometimes the greatest kindness the world can offer is simply a solid roof and a door that no one intends to break through before morning. There were, of course, darker passages in his journey, places where the line between the living and the dead thinned enough that a man could walk from one realm to the other and return with stories no one really wanted to hear before bedtime. Yet even those have, over time, taken on a different hue in memory, as if someone has turned down the brightness and left only outlines and echoes behind. The land of shadow where he spoke with those who were no longer among the living is, in his recollection during quiet nights, less a place of horror than a kind of solemn waiting room where regrets sit side by side with unfinished sentences. The faces he saw there, pale and half-formed, were not bloody or grotesque but simply thin, like charcoal sketches compared to the fully painted figures of the living, and their voices sounded more like dried leaves brushed together by a faint breeze than like anything that could keep a man awake in terror. He remembers returning from that place exhausted in a way that went beyond muscles and bones, as if his very thoughts had walked too far in too little time. When night fell again on the world of sunlight and stone and water, he lay beside his ship with his cloak pulled over his head and listened gratefully to the familiar, solid noises of the living, a man snoring too loudly, another muttering in his sleep, the creak of timbers as the ship shifted slightly with the tide. After the unsteady ground of that other realm, the rough sand beneath his shoulder felt almost luxurious, and the small ache in his back from an inconveniently placed pebble was a comforting reminder that he still possessed a body that complained about such things. If the dead visited his dreams that night, they did so at the edges only, like distant acquaintances glimpsed in a crowd rather than figures looming at his bedside. At last, as even the most patient of gods must have realized he would eventually, his path arced back toward Ithaca, though the sea and those same gods took care to send him home not as the shining victor of straightforward tales, but as a weathered stranger with salt in his beard and calluses on his hands, a man who had learned thoroughly that homecoming is a slow craft and not a single dramatic leap. He came to his island under the cover of mist and disguise, led more by cautious wisdom than by the reckless pride of his youth, and the first night he spent there was not in his own bed but in the humble hut of Eumaeus, the swineherd whose loyalty had stayed rooted in that rocky soil even while his master's story wandered far beyond the horizon. That hut, built of rough branches, clay, and whatever materials the hillside offered, stood among pens and low stone walls, its roof thatched and patched in places where storms had made their opinions known. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, animals, and the simple stew that simmered in a blackened pot over a low fire. There were no painted walls there, no carved couches or bronze mirrors, only a few stools, blankets that had known long use, and an assortment of everyday tools hanging on pegs, each one familiar to a hand that had used it 1,000 times. When the door was closed against the night and the wind had been politely escorted back outside, the only light came from the hearth, where the fire burned small and steady, throwing just enough glow to show faces and hands and to make shadows of everything else. Eumaeus, not recognizing the true nature of his guest, fussed over him anyway, in that quiet, practical way that truly kind people often have. He set out what food he could spare, apologizing for its simplicity while Odysseus, who had dined with sorceresses and immortals, ate it with genuine appreciation, because hunger is a far better spice than any exotic herb. Later, when it was time to sleep, the swineherd spread blankets for him near the fire, adding an extra layer without comment, perhaps guessing that the stranger carried more cold within him than the mild Ithacan night alone could account for. The dogs, who had barked earlier at his arrival, now circled twice, decided he was acceptable, and flopped down nearby, their warm, solid bodies a living barrier between those inside the hut and whatever prowled outside. As he lay down on that hard but blessedly familiar earth, with the murmur of Eumaeus breathing behind him and the occasional soft snuffle from the dogs, Odysseus felt something shift inside him, something that had been wound tightly for so long it had begun to forget any other shape. The wind outside rattled the door and slipped thin fingers through the gaps in the walls, but the fire pushed back bravely, filling the small space with a warmth that was more than physical. He watched the last flame lick lazily at a half-burnt log before surrendering to a bed of glowing embers, and in that dim red light the hut's walls, patched and uneven, looked to him more beautiful than all the polished stones of far-off palaces. He slept that night as a man sleeps who has finally stepped onto the soil that has waited for his footprints, even if the path still ahead inside that familiar land is not yet safe. There remained, of course, the matter of the hall, the arrogant suitors, the threatened household, and the delicate, dangerous work of reclaiming what had been kept alive but not intact in his absence. Yet even in those days, full of tension and hidden identities, there were nights that moved with a slow, almost ritual pace, nights in which the drama that would fill songs one day shrank down to small, human details softened by darkness. On the evening before he chose to reveal himself fully, he lay once more in his own house, though not yet in his own bed, listening to the sounds that drifted through the walls, the faint scrape and shuffle of servants cleaning away the leavings of the suitors' feast, the thick, careless laughter of men who believed themselves safe, and somewhere, much farther inside, the steady, measured click of a loom where Penelope continued her long and careful struggle against time and pressure. He felt the weight of his bow near him, wrapped and concealed, its unstrung curve as familiar to him as the feel of his own arm, and he thought of all that had passed between the last time he had held it openly and now. The bed he lay on was narrow and not particularly comfortable, a temporary place given to a guest whom the household only half believed in. Yet as he shifted to find a spot where his shoulder bothered him less, he smiled inwardly at the thought that he, who had slept in caves and under upturned hulls, in royal chambers and on bare rock, now found himself once again complaining, if only to himself, about the way a bed in his own house pressed the wrong way against his ribs. There was a strange comfort in that small annoyance. It meant that beneath the swirl of divine grudges and heroic destinies, he was still, unmistakably, an ordinary man with a body that did not always cooperate and a mind that could still notice the minor imperfections of a mattress. Somewhere in the house, a servant hummed a fragment of a song as she worked, a tune so simple and old that it seemed to rise out of the walls themselves rather than from any particular throat. The sound threaded its way through the dark like smoke, thin but persistent, and reached his ears as he watched the faint orange glow of banked coals in a distant corner. Those coals, carefully covered to keep them alive until morning, reminded him of all the quiet acts of preservation that had been taking place in his absence, Penelope's weaving and unweaving, his son's slow growth from child to young man, the servants who had stayed loyal even when it was safer to pretend that loyalty had died, and even this old house itself, which had stubbornly continued to stand despite the noise and waste it witnessed each day. As he drifted toward sleep, he felt less like a conquering hero preparing to reclaim his throne and more like a man about to rejoin a story that others had been carrying forward in their own quiet ways while he was gone. In time, and he had learned, more than most, that time moves according to its own patient logic rather than according to anyone's plan, the hall was his again, though not after some simple, bloodless negotiation. Yet the songs that later made much of bows bending and proud men falling seldom lingered on what happened after the shouting stopped and the torches were put out one by one, as if the story, having reached its sharp peak, lost interest in the slow descent back into ordinary breathing. But that slow descent is where the body lives, and where sleep waits, and it is there that Odysseus, finally, truly came home. The first night after order had been coaxed, with some effort, back into the bones of the house, the great hall lay unusually quiet. The rushes on the floor, freshly changed, still smelled faintly of green fields, and the walls, wiped clean of smoke and grime as best as weary hands could manage, seemed to stand a little taller, as if remembering their original purpose. The lamps burned low in their niches, their flames steady now that no one was waving arms or arguments beneath them, and the air was filled not with the heavy odor of too much meat and unearned wine, but with the more modest sense of bread baking for the morning, wool drying near the fire, and the indefinable, familiar smell of people who belong in a place rather than merely occupy it. In their hidden chamber, behind the doors that had guarded its secret for so many years, the bed he had carved with his own hands waited. It was not a grand piece by the standards of master craftsmen, but it was clever, solid, and rooted, quite literally, into the living trunk of an olive tree that had once grown where the room now stood. When he and Penelope entered that room together at last, the steps they took were slow, not because they were hesitant in feeling, but because so much lay behind those steps that the body needed time to catch up with the heart. The bed stood there exactly where he remembered leaving it, the wood worn smooth in places by years of use, the linens fresh, the blanket neatly folded back by careful hands that had done this small, steady thing in hope long after hope should reasonably have packed its bags and gone elsewhere. As he sat on the edge of that bed, feeling the familiar give of the mattress beneath him and the old, subtle scent of the wood rise like a long-delayed greeting, Odysseus understood, more clearly than any epic speech could express, what it meant to arrive. Not to arrive at a city taken by force, or at an island ruled by immortals, or at a palace temporarily loaned by generous strangers, but to arrive at the one piece of earth where every scratch on the furniture, every creak in the floor, every uneven stone in the courtyard had a story that belonged, in some small way, to him. He lay down, and the bed accepted his weight like an old friend, adjusting without protest, and Penelope, who had fought her own quieter war all these years, lay beside him with the calm of someone who has finally been given permission by the universe to stop bracing for one more test. Outside, the night moved on as it always did, untroubled by the dramas of any one household. The wind slipped through the olive trees on the hillside with the soft, dry whisper of leaves brushing against one another, and the sea, never entirely silent on an island, murmured its usual commentaries at the shore, indifferent but oddly comforting. Within the house, servants who had spent the day in shocked, grateful labor now slept, some on pallets in corners, some in small adjacent rooms, all of them exhausted in the best possible way. The dogs, having finally learned that their master was not merely some tedious rumor but an actual presence again, lay stretched near the door, their chests rising and falling in slow, contented rhythm. In the dark, Odysseus could barely make out the curve of the ceiling above him, the outline of a beam here and there, and the faint loom of the doorway where a sliver of light from a nearly spent lamp in the outer room crept under the bar. He listened to the sounds of his house at rest, the subtle creaks and sighs that any structure makes when it has had a long day, and felt his own breath fall naturally into that pattern. For once, his thoughts did not fling themselves towards some new problem or distant island, they folded inward, like sails finally furled after a voyage that has lasted much longer than anyone planned. The long catalogue of dangers and losses did not vanish, of course, but they moved to the far edges of his awareness, like distant ships seen only as faint silhouettes on the horizon. His body, which had for so many years responded to every unexpected sound with twisting readiness, began to relearn a different set of responses. The tension in his shoulders eased first, then the tightness along his back, then the restless readiness in his legs, until at last even his hands, those hands that had gripped oars and sword hilts and the edges of too many rafts, lay open and relaxed against the linen. His breathing slowed, lengthening into the deep, even pattern of a man who is no longer guarding a ship or a secret but simply lying in his own bed, in his own house, on his own island, with the person who has waited longer than any mortal should reasonably be expected to wait. Outside, high above Ithaca and its terraces and harbors and huts, the same stars that had watched him leave, wander, argue with gods, and wash up on strange shores now watched him rest. They looked down on a small house where a man who had been called clever and cunning and lucky and cursed was, for the moment, simply asleep. The wind that had once filled the sails of 1,000 ships now moved gently through olive branches and over tilled fields, carrying the faint smell of earth and leaf and distant sea into open windows. The sea itself, which had raged and conspired and shifted beneath his keel, now lapped patiently at the island's edges, outlining it in sound like a careful craftsman tracing a familiar pattern. In time, even the last lamp in the outer room went out, its wick surrendering to darkness with a soft sigh and a wisp of smoke that dissolved unseen into the air. The house settled more deeply into stillness. The coals in the kitchen hearth glowed faintly under their ash, kept just alive enough to be coaxed back into flame when morning came, much as the people within these walls had kept hope banked but unextinguished through long years of uncertainty. In that gentle dark, everything narrowed naturally, the wide world of storm and ship and distant islands shrinking down to the small, steady circle of a bed, two resting forms, the slow rise and fall of breath, and the quiet, patient turning of the earth beneath them. And so he sleeps, this much-traveled man, not as a figure in a poem or a statue on a windswept cliff, but as any tired sailor or farmer or herdsman might sleep at the end of a long, demanding life, deeply, quietly, with the weight of his body supported by well-known wood and linen, his thoughts finally no louder than the faint murmur of his own heartbeat in his ears. The world outside his door continues its endless movements, waves climbing and falling on distant shores, ships setting out toward new stories, stars sliding slowly across the sky, but here, in this room rooted around an olive tree, the motion slows almost to stillness, and all the long journey resolves itself into the simplest of destinations, a place to lie down, a roof overhead, the warmth of another body close by, and a night that asks nothing more of him than that he breathe in and breathe out, gently, until the first pale suggestion of dawn touches the horizon and the story, for now, can afford to stay sleeping a little longer.